I need a boyfriend. A millionaire hears his maid say and makes the most unexpected decision. Sophie moved the cloth in slow circles across the gleaming granite countertop, the lavender-scented cleaner filling the massive kitchen with its soothing fragrance. Sunlight streamed through the wall of windows, casting long shadows across the professional-grade appliances and highlighting specks of dust floating in the air. The kitchen was spotless, as it always was after she finished her daily cleaning routine. But today, the pristine surfaces only emphasized how empty the space felt. Her footsteps echoed against the hardwood floors as she moved to put away the cleaning supplies. The sound reminded her just how alone she was in this enormous house. Sure, there were other staff members around during the day, but they all went home to their families and loved ones. Sophie returned to her small apartment above the garage, where only her collection of houseplants waited for her. She glanced at her reflection in the polished surface of the refrigerator. At 28, she had built a stable life for herself, working her way up from part-time housekeeper to full-time estate manager. But something was missing. The ache in her chest had been growing stronger lately, especially during quiet moments like these when the mansion felt more like a beautiful cage than a workplace. Pulling out her phone, Sophie checked her messages. Nothing but work-related texts and a reminder about next week's grocery delivery. She sighed, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The last date she'd been on was months ago. A coffee meetup that had felt more like a job interview than a romantic encounter. Moving to the sink, she began washing the few dishes left from lunch. The repetitive motion of scrubbing and rinsing usually helped clear her mind, but today her thoughts kept drifting to couples she'd seen walking hand in hand in the park, sharing coffee at local cafes, or stealing quiet moments together in the vineyard's rose garden. What I wouldn't give for someone to share my Netflix password with, she mumbled to herself, placing the last dish in the drying rack. Someone to cook dinner for, someone to... She paused, realizing how pathetic she sounded talking to herself in this empty kitchen. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the room as Sophie wiped her hands on her apron. She leaned against the counter, her shoulders slumping slightly. I need a boyfriend, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, making her feel even more vulnerable than before. Well, that's an interesting way to end the workday. Sophie whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway, his tall frame filling the space. Heat rushed to her cheeks as she realized he must have heard her private moment of longing. How long had he been standing there? He stepped into the kitchen, his expression unreadable, but his eyes holding an unusual warmth. Sophie, I actually came to ask you something. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she'd noticed he made when he was thinking carefully about his words. There's a vineyard about an hour from here that I need to visit tomorrow. Would you be willing to come along? I could use your expertise in evaluating some of their operational systems. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, though she tried to maintain her professional composure despite her earlier embarrassment. This was work, she reminded herself firmly, even as something in his voice made her wonder if there was more to the invitation than just business. Sophie blinked, trying to process Daniel's unexpected invitation. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, with him standing there in his tailored suit, waiting for her response. Her fingers nervously played with the edge of her apron. Tomorrow? She asked, buying time to collect her thoughts. In the 3 years she'd worked at the mansion, she'd rarely left the grounds with Daniel. Their interactions had always been professional, confined to staff meetings and brief exchanges about household matters. Daniel nodded, his dark eyes studying her face. We'd leave around 9 in the morning. It should only take the day. He shifted his weight, and Sophie noticed he seemed almost uncertain. It was an unusual look for a man who typically radiated confidence. "Of course, I'd be happy to help," she said, trying to sound more assured than she felt. "Should I prepare anything specific for the trip?" "Just bring yourself," he replied, then added quickly, "and maybe a notebook. The vineyard's having some staffing issues, and I'd value your perspective on their management structure." Sophie nodded, already mentally reviewing her wardrobe. What did one wear to evaluate a vineyard? Her usual work attire of black pants and a crisp white shirt seemed too formal, but jeans felt too casual. "I'll have James bring the car around at 8:45, Daniel said, turning to leave. He paused at the doorway. "And Sophie?" His voice had softened slightly. "Thank you." The next morning arrived with a mix of autumn crispness and lingering summer warmth. Sophie had settled on dark slacks and a pale blue blouse, professional but comfortable enough for walking through grapevines. She stood by the mansion's front entrance, clutching her leather notebook and trying not to look as nervous as she felt. The black SUV pulled up precisely at 8:45. To her surprise, Daniel was behind the wheel instead of James, their usual driver. He stepped out and opened the passenger door for her, a gesture that made her stomach do an unexpected flip. "I thought we could stop for coffee on the way," he said as they pulled out of the long driveway. "There's a place about 20 minutes from here that makes excellent lattes." The first part of the drive passed in slightly awkward silence. Sophie found herself hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. The leather seats were butter-soft beneath her, and the car smelled of Daniel's subtle cologne mixed with new car leather. True to his word, Daniel pulled into a small coffee shop tucked between a bookstore and a bakery. "What's your poison?" he asked, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, just a regular coffee with cream," Sophie replied, reaching for her purse. Daniel waved her hand away. "My treat. Regular coffee with cream," he repeated, then added with a hint of teasing, "Really living on the edge there, Sophie." She couldn't help but laugh. "Hey, some of us don't need our coffee to have more syllables than a doctoral thesis." When he returned with their drinks, Sophie noticed he was actually grinning. "For the record," he said, handing her the cup, "mine only has 3 syllables, caramel macchiato." "Still more complicated than necessary," she retorted, feeling the tension between them start to ease. Back on the road, they fell into a more comfortable rhythm, the coffee warming both their hands and the atmosphere. The morning sun painted the landscape in soft golds and greens as they headed towards the vineyard, and Sophie found herself stealing glances at Daniel's profile as he drove, wondering what other surprises this day might hold. The SUV crunched over gravel as they pulled into the vineyard's entrance. Sophie's breath caught in her throat at the sight before her. Endless rows of grapevines stretched toward the horizon, their leaves dancing in the morning breeze. The late summer sun bathed everything in a golden glow, making the dew drops on the vines sparkle like tiny diamonds. "It's beautiful," she whispered, pressing her hand against the window. A magnificent stone building rose in the distance, its weathered walls telling stories of decades gone by. Wild roses climbed its facade, adding splashes of pink and red to the sandy-colored stone. Daniel parked near the main building and came around to open her door. As Sophie stepped out, the fresh air filled her lungs, crisp and sweet with hints of fruit and earth. The gentle slope of the hill revealed more of the vineyard's splendor. Neat rows of vines extended in every direction, creating a geometric pattern that was somehow both orderly and natural. "The original vineyard was planted in 1922, Daniel explained, as they walked along a well-maintained path between the vines. "These particular vines are about 30 years old." Sophie reached out to touch a leaf, marveling at its delicate texture. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like something from a painting." They continued their walk, with Daniel pointing out different grape varieties and explaining the growing process. Sophie noticed how his shoulders seemed to tense more with each step, despite the peaceful surroundings. His earlier warmth from their coffee shop conversation had faded, replaced by something heavier. "The soil here is perfect for growing Cabernet Sauvignon," he said, but his voice sounded distant, as if his mind was elsewhere. He stopped to examine a cluster of grapes, but Sophie could tell he wasn't really seeing them. The morning sun climbed higher, and a gentle breeze rustled through the vines. In any other circumstance, it would have been idyllic, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Daniel's jaw was set in a tight line, his hands clasped behind his back in that formal way he did when something was bothering him. "Daniel," Sophie said softly, touching his arm gently. He startled slightly at the contact. "Is everything all right? You seem troubled?" He turned to look at her, and for a moment, Sophie saw something vulnerable flash across his face. Worry, perhaps, or fear. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished behind his usual composed expression. "Everything's fine," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Just thinking about some business matters." He gestured toward another section of the vineyard. "We should check the eastern slopes before it gets too hot." But Sophie noticed how he wouldn't quite meet her eyes, how his fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous habit she'd observed during particularly stressful board meetings. Whatever was weighing on him, it was clearly more than just business matters. As they walked toward the eastern slopes, the tension remained, hanging between them like an invisible wall. The beauty of the vineyard continued to unfold around them, but Daniel seemed to grow more distant with each step, lost in thoughts he wasn't ready to share. A weathered wooden bench sat nestled beneath an old oak tree, offering a perfect view of the rolling vineyard below. Sophie followed Daniel to it, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The morning had warmed considerably, but here in the shade, a cool breeze offered welcome relief. As they settled onto the bench, Sophie couldn't help but notice how Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly, so different from his usual perfect posture. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. The peaceful scene before them, rows upon rows of carefully tended vines stretching toward the horizon, seemed at odds with his troubled demeanor. "You know," Sophie said softly, "my grandmother used to say that a burden shared is a burden halved." She turned slightly toward him, careful to give him space but wanting him to know she was there. "I'm a pretty good listener." Daniel's lips quirked up slightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He picked up a fallen leaf, turning it over and over in his fingers. "You've only known me for a few months, Sophie, but you seem to read me better than people I've known for years." "Maybe that's because I actually pay attention," she replied, keeping her tone gentle. "And right now something's clearly eating at you." The leaf in Daniel's hands crumbled as his fingers tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared out at the vineyard. When he finally spoke, his voice was unusually quiet. "This place, it's been in my family for 3 generations." Sophie waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. A bird called somewhere in the distance, its song carrying clearly in the morning air. "My grandfather planted some of these vines with his own hands," Daniel continued. "He used to bring me here when I was little, taught me everything about winemaking." He swallowed hard. But sometimes tradition isn't enough. "What do you mean?" Sophie asked, her heart starting to sink as she noticed the pain in his eyes. Daniel stood up abruptly, taking a few steps forward. His back was rigid now, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. The vineyard's been struggling for the past few years. Bad seasons, increased competition, rising costs. He shook his head. I've tried everything, Sophie. Everything. But the numbers don't lie. Sophie felt her chest tighten as she began to understand where this was heading. Daniel. He turned back to face her, and the raw emotion in his expression made her breath catch. I've received an offer from Stellar Vineyards Corporation. They want to buy the entire property. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Sophie felt as though someone had knocked the wind out of her. You're going to sell it? The paperwork is being drawn up now, he said, his voice flat. They're planning to modernize everything, make it more efficient. The last word came out bitter, like it left a bad taste in his mouth. Sophie stood up slowly, her mind reeling from the revelation. The beautiful vineyard around them suddenly seemed more precious, more fragile. She looked at the historic stone building in the distance, the lovingly tended vines, trying to imagine it all transformed into some corporate operation. Does anyone else know? She asked quietly. No, Daniel replied, running a hand through his hair. You're the first person I've told. He let out a humorless laugh. I haven't even found the courage to tell my own staff yet. They stood there in heavy silence, the weight of his confession settling around them like an invisible cloud. The cheerful morning sunshine now felt almost mocking against the gravity of the moment. Sophie stepped closer to Daniel, her mind racing with questions. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the oak leaves above them, creating shifting patterns on the ground between them. I understand this must be incredibly difficult, she said carefully. But are you sure selling is the only option? Daniel's shoulders tensed. What choice do I have? The maintenance costs alone are crushing us. Every time we fix one thing, another breaks down. He gestured toward the distant buildings. The irrigation system needs a complete overhaul. The processing equipment is aging. And don't even get me started on the property taxes. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, thinking. What about applying for historical preservation status? That might help with the tax burden. I've looked into it, Daniel replied, but there was a note of surprise in his voice at her suggestion. The paperwork is overwhelming, and there's no guarantee we'd qualify. But you haven't actually tried, Sophie pressed gently. Daniel ran his hands over his face. I've been trying to handle everything myself. My father... He paused, his voice growing quieter. When he passed away 3 years ago, I wasn't prepared for any of this. He always made it look so easy. Sophie's heart ached at the pain in his voice. You don't have to do it alone, you know? The staff is wonderful, but at the end of the day, all the decisions, all the responsibility, it falls on me. He picked up a stone and tossed it down the hill, watching it bounce among the vines. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, terrified that I'm going to be the one who loses everything my family built. That's a heavy burden to carry by yourself, Sophie said softly. She hesitated, then added, But Daniel, selling to a corporation? Wouldn't that be exactly what you're afraid of? Losing everything your family built? He turned to look at her. Really look at her, for the first time since his confession. I hadn't thought of it that way. What about local investors? Sophie suggested, warming to her topic. People who might appreciate the history and want to preserve it? Or what about turning part of the property into a wedding venue? These views are spectacular. A wedding venue? Daniel repeated, a small spark of interest flickering in his eyes. Think about it. You already have the perfect setting. The wine, the romance of a family vineyard. People pay a fortune for destinations like this. Sophie gestured at the rolling hills around them. And it wouldn't interfere with the wine production. If anything, it might help market the wines. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, but Sophie could almost see the wheels turning in his mind. The old stone building near the entrance. My grandfather used to talk about how they held harvest festivals there. See? That's exactly the kind of history people love. Sophie felt her enthusiasm growing. And there must be other options we haven't even thought of yet. We? Daniel asked, raising an eyebrow. Sophie blushed slightly but held her ground. Yes, we. Unless you'd rather tackle all that paperwork for historical preservation status by yourself? For the first time that morning, a genuine smile tugged at Daniel's lips. You know, I've been so focused on what I might lose, I haven't really considered fighting for it. He looked out over the vineyard again, but this time his gaze was more thoughtful than defeated. Maybe there are other ways. They walked along the rows of grapevines, their shoes crunching on the gravel path. Sophie trailed her fingers along the leaves, feeling their waxy texture. The morning dew had dried, leaving behind a crisp freshness in the air. So this is where your father taught you about winemaking? She asked, watching Daniel's face soften at the memory. Right here in these rows. He touched one of the wooden posts supporting the vines. He'd quiz me on the different varieties. Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Chardonnay. I used to think it was just another chore, you know. His voice cracked slightly. Now I'd give anything to hear one of his lectures again. Sophie's throat tightened. She could picture a younger Daniel walking these same paths with his father, learning the family trade. The weight of that legacy pressed against her heart. Tell me more about him, she encouraged softly. Daniel stopped at an old oak barrel that served as a makeshift table. He was the kind of person who knew everyone's name, not just the workers, but their families too. Every harvest season he'd organize this huge feast. His eyes grew distant with the memory. The tables would stretch from here all the way down to that cypress tree. Everyone who worked here would bring their families. My mother would spend days cooking. Sophie could almost hear the echoes of laughter, smell the food, see the tables laden with dishes and wine bottles. Her eyes stung with unexpected tears. You must miss them terribly, she whispered. More than I can say. Daniel's hand brushed against the weathered wood of the barrel. Sometimes I come out here early in the morning before anyone else arrives, and I swear I can hear my father's voice in the wind, telling me which vines need attention. Sophie's chest ached with empathy. She'd lost her own parents young, and though their circumstances were different, she recognized the hollow space that loss carved out inside a person. They reached a small stone wall, and Daniel sat down, patting the space beside him. Sophie joined him, conscious of the small distance between them. You know what's strange, he said, staring out at the neat rows of vines stretching into the distance. I've never told anyone these things before, not even my closest friends. Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who's just listening, Sophie replied, understanding flowing between them. Someone who isn't tangled up in all the history. Yeah, he agreed quietly. I guess that's it. A cool breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying the sweet scent of ripening grapes. Sophie shifted slightly, and her hand accidentally brushed against Daniel's where it rested on the rough stone between them. Neither of them moved. The simple touch sent a current of awareness through her, and she felt the air around them change, becoming charged with unspoken possibilities. They sat there in weighted silence, their hands barely touching, while the vineyard continued its ancient rhythm around them. Sophie's heart thundered in her chest as she pulled her hand away from Daniel's. The touch, though accidental, had awakened something she'd been trying to suppress for months. Working in his mansion, she'd caught glimpses of the man beneath the wealthy exterior, the way he left coffee for the gardener on cold mornings, how he remembered everyone's birthdays, his quiet moments of kindness that he thought no one noticed. Standing up abruptly, she walked a few steps away, wrapping her arms around herself. The vineyard stretched before her, row after endless row of vines reaching toward the horizon. Behind her, she heard Daniel shift on the stone wall. "Sophie?" His voice was gentle, concerned. "What's wrong?" She closed her eyes, drawing in a shaky breath. The scent of earth and grape leaves filled her lungs, giving her courage. "I can't keep pretending," she whispered, then turned to face him. "I can't keep acting like you're just my employer, like being around you doesn't affect me." Daniel stood slowly, his expression careful, guarded. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying—" Sophie's voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. The words she'd held back for so long tumbled out. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Daniel. Not with your mansion or your money or any of that. With you, the man who feeds stray cats when he thinks no one's looking, who keeps old Christmas cards in his desk drawer, who cares so much about this vineyard it breaks his heart." The silence that followed felt eternal. Daniel stood completely still, his eyes wide with surprise. Sophie's chest tightened with each passing second, regret and embarrassment burning in her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, turning away. "I shouldn't have—" "Wait." Daniel's hand caught her arm, gentle but firm. When she looked back at him, his face was a mix of vulnerability and fear she'd never seen before. "Do you know why I've kept everyone at arm's length all these years?" Sophie shook her head, hardly daring to breathe. "Because it's easier to hide behind wealth," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To let people see the bank account, the cars, the mansion, but never me. Never." He gestured helplessly. "Never the mess inside, the doubt, the fear of not living up to my father's legacy, the loneliness." He released her arm, running a hand through his hair. "But you've always seen through it, haven't you? Every time I tried to maintain that distance, you'd do something. Bring me tea when I worked late, leave wildflowers on my desk, ask about my day, and actually listen. You made it impossible to keep hiding." "I never meant to make you uncomfortable," Sophie said softly. "No." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes intense. "You made me feel seen. Really seen, for the first time since my parents died. And it terrified me because—" He took a deep breath. "Because I've fallen in love with you too, Sophie. And it's so much easier to hide behind wealth than to admit that someone has that kind of power over your heart." The drive back to the mansion felt different. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the winding road as Daniel's car hummed beneath them. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. Her confession at the vineyard still hung in the air between them, not heavy but present, like a delicate thread connecting their hearts. Daniel kept stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. His hands gripped the steering wheel a bit tighter than usual, and Sophie noticed how he'd occasionally open his mouth as if to speak, then close it again. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with possibility. As they pulled into the long driveway of the mansion, the gravel crunching under the tires, Sophie's mind wandered to all the times she'd walked this path as just the housekeeper. Now everything felt different, charged with new meaning. Daniel parked the car and hurried around to open her door before she could reach for the handle. It was such a small gesture, but it made her cheeks warm. Their fingers brushed as she took his offered hand, sending tingles up her arm. "Thank you," she said softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. They walked to the front door together, closer than they'd ever stood before. The massive wooden door seemed less intimidating now, less like a barrier between their two worlds. Inside, the mansion's grand foyer welcomed them with its familiar warmth. Sophie started to head toward the kitchen, habit from months of working here. But Daniel's gentle touch on her elbow stopped her. Would you— He cleared his throat. Would you like to have dinner with me? Here? His usual confidence was replaced with an endearing nervousness that made Sophie's heart flutter. I'd like that, she replied, watching his face light up with relief. I'll cook, he said quickly, then added with a self-deprecating smile. Though I should warn you, my culinary skills are limited to about 3 dishes. Sophie laughed, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I've seen your attempts at cooking, remember? Maybe we could cook together? In the kitchen, they moved around each other with a new awareness. Sophie reached for ingredients while Daniel preheated the oven, their dance in the kitchen both familiar and thrillingly different. When she handed him a bowl, their fingers touched, and neither pulled away as quickly as they would have before. It feels strange, Sophie admitted as she chopped vegetables. Being here like this. Not as your housekeeper, but as yourself, Daniel finished for her, his voice gentle. As the woman who somehow saw past all my walls. The simple pasta dish they prepared together felt more special than any fancy restaurant meal. Daniel insisted on setting the table properly, complete with candles, and the good china that usually sat gathering dust in the cabinet. They sat across from each other at the smaller breakfast table, rather than the formal dining room. The candlelight flickered between them, casting soft shadows that made everything feel more intimate. Sophie watched as Daniel poured them each a glass of wine from his vineyard, the same vineyard where everything had changed just hours ago. To new beginnings? He offered, raising his glass. Sophie lifted hers, meeting his eyes across the table. To new beginnings? She echoed, her voice soft but sure. The tension between them was gentle, like a warm blanket rather than an uncomfortable weight. As they began to eat, stealing glances at each other between bites, Sophie realized that for the first time in years, she felt completely at home. The morning sun streamed through the mansion's east-facing windows, casting long, golden rectangles across the kitchen floor. Sophie had been up since dawn, her mind racing with ideas. She'd spread papers across the kitchen island, scribbling notes while her coffee grew cold beside her. When Daniel walked in, his tie slightly crooked and hair still damp from his shower, he stopped short at the sight. "You're up early," he said, his voice warm with surprise. Sophie looked up, her eyes bright with determination. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the vineyard." She shuffled through her notes, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I hope you don't mind. I did some research." Daniel moved closer, picking up one of her handwritten pages. His shoulder brushed against hers as he leaned in to read. "You did all this last night?" "This morning, actually." Sophie pointed to different sections of her notes. "Look, there are government grants available for historic agricultural properties. And here, there's a program that supports sustainable farming practices. The vineyard might qualify for both." Daniel set his briefcase down and pulled up a stool next to her. The kitchen filled with the scent of his cologne, subtle and expensive, but somehow comforting now rather than intimidating. "Sophie, you didn't have to do this. I wanted to." She turned to face him, their knees almost touching. "That vineyard means something to you, which means it means something to me too." His expression softened, and he reached for her hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. They spent the next hour going through Sophie's research. She'd found similar vineyards that had faced financial troubles and turned things around. Daniel added his own notes, his neat handwriting filling the margins of her pages. "We should talk to Marcus," Daniel said, referring to his vineyard manager. "And Richard, my financial advisor. They'll have a better picture of exactly where we stand." Sophie nodded, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "When can we meet them?" "I can call them now. They're usually at the vineyard by 8. Daniel pulled out his phone, then paused. Are you sure you want to be involved in all this? It could get complicated. I'm sure, Sophie said firmly. She straightened his crooked tie without thinking, her fingers lingering for a moment on his chest. Besides, you need someone in your corner who isn't just looking at the bottom line. The drive to the vineyard felt different from yesterday. The morning air was crisp, and Sophie watched the countryside roll by, mentally rehearsing everything she wanted to say. Daniel's hand found hers across the center console, giving it a gentle squeeze. They found Marcus and Richard waiting in the vineyard's main office. Marcus, weathered and kind-faced, greeted them warmly. Richard, in his pressed suit and wire-rimmed glasses, looked less welcoming. Daniel, Richard said, his tone clipped. I thought we'd settled this matter yesterday. His eyes flickered to Sophie, then back to Daniel. The buyers are expecting an answer by the end of the week. We're exploring other options, Daniel replied, spreading Sophie's research on the desk. There might be ways to keep the vineyard running. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. With all due respect, he said, though his tone held little, the numbers don't lie. The vineyard's operating costs are— We understand the challenges, Sophie interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But we've found some alternatives that could help offset those costs. Richard's eyebrows shot up at her use of we, and he turned to Daniel with a disapproving frown. The tension in the room thickened, and Sophie felt Daniel's shoulders stiffen beside her. Marcus stepped forward, picking up one of Sophie's papers. Maybe we should at least hear them out, he said quietly, but Richard was already shaking his head. Sophie watched as Daniel's confidence began to crumble under Richard's relentless assault of numbers and projections. The financial advisor had spent the last 20 minutes detailing every cost, debt, and projected loss with clinical precision. The maintenance alone for the next quarter, Richard continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, will eat through any reserves we might generate. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Sophie had come to recognize as a sign of his growing distress. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe I'm just postponing the inevitable. No. Sophie's voice came out sharper than she intended, making everyone in the room turn to look at her. She softened her tone, but kept her determination. Daniel, you can't give up this easily. Not after everything you told me yesterday. Marcus nodded from his corner of the room. The girl's right. This place has been in your family for generations. And it's been losing money for the last 3, Richard countered, spreading more papers across the desk. Sentiment won't pay the bills. Sophie stepped closer to Daniel, placing her hand on his arm. Look at me, she said softly. When he met her eyes, she saw the conflict there, the war between his heart and his head. Remember what you said about your grandfather? How he used to tell you that every vine has a story? Daniel's expression softened at the memory. Sophie. No, listen to me. She turned to face the whole room. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This vineyard employs local families. It's part of this community's history. There has to be a way to save it. Richard sighed heavily. Miss, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but— What about a fundraiser? Sophie interrupted, the idea forming as she spoke. Something big, something that could showcase everything this vineyard has to offer. We could invite local businesses, wine enthusiasts, maybe even some of your high society contacts, Daniel. Daniel straightened slightly, a hint of interest crossing his face. What kind of fundraiser? An evening under the stars, Sophie said, warming to her idea. We could set up tables right here among the vines. Wine tasting, of course, featuring your best vintages. Local restaurants could provide food. We could have music, auctions. She turned to Marcus. Didn't you say there were some rare bottles in the cellar? Marcus nodded eagerly. Some dating back 30 years or more. Richard scoffed. A party isn't going to generate the kind of money we need. Maybe not all of it, Sophie admitted. But it could buy us time. Show potential investors that there's still life here, still possibility. She squeezed Daniel's arm. It's worth trying, isn't it? Daniel looked around the room slowly, taking in the vineyard office with its old wooden beams and walls lined with faded photographs of his family. His gaze lingered on a picture of his grandfather, standing proudly among the vines. It's a long shot, he said finally, his voice tired but carrying a thread of hope. Most things worth doing are, Sophie replied softly. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, he said, straightening his shoulders. Let's try it. Richard, can you run the numbers on what we'd need to make this work? Richard's disapproval was clear, but he pulled out his calculator. It won't be enough, he muttered. Maybe not, Daniel agreed, but his voice was stronger now. But Sophie's right. We have to try. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by lists and papers, her laptop open beside her. She'd been making calls all morning, reaching out to local businesses and potential donors. Daniel paced behind her, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with another potential sponsor. Yes, that's right, he said, his voice carrying a newfound enthusiasm that made Sophie smile. We're planning a grand evening under the stars, showcasing the best of what our vineyard has to offer. Sophie checked another name off her list and added a note. The past few days had been a whirlwind of activity. She'd discovered that Daniel's business connections were invaluable. Many people seemed eager to attend an event at his prestigious vineyard. That's wonderful news, Daniel said into the phone. We'll send you the formal invitation right away. He ended the call and leaned over Sophie's shoulder, his presence warm and comforting. The Riverside restaurant is in. They'll handle the main course for the dinner. Perfect, Sophie beamed, adding it to her spreadsheet. And the local cheese shop agreed to provide appetizers. Oh, and Marcus found those vintage bottles he mentioned. There are 12 of them. Perfect for the auction. Daniel pulled up a chair beside her, their shoulders touching. You're amazing at this, you know that? I never would have thought of half these ideas. Sophie felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Well, I used to help organize charity events at my old job. Nothing this big, though. She glanced at the budget calculations on her screen, and her stomach tightened. Daniel, do you think we're doing enough? The numbers we need to hit? Hey, Daniel said softly, taking her hand. Whatever happens, we're trying. That's more than I was doing before you came along. Sophie squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his touch. Marcus said he'd start clearing the area by the old oak tree. It'll be perfect for the dining setup. They worked through the afternoon, making calls, sending emails, and coordinating with vendors. Sophie couldn't help but notice how different Daniel seemed now. More engaged, more alive. When they took a break to walk through the vineyard and check potential event locations, she saw him looking at the vines with renewed interest. My grandfather would have loved this, he said, running his hand along a gnarled vine. He always said the vineyard was meant to bring people together. As the sun began to set, they reviewed their progress. The guest list was growing, the menu was set, and local musicians had agreed to perform. But when Sophie looked at the financial projections, worry crept back in. Even if we sell every ticket, and all the auction items go for top dollar? She bit her lip, not wanting to finish the thought. Daniel studied the numbers over her shoulder. It might not be enough, he acknowledged quietly. We could add more auction items, Sophie suggested, though her voice wavered. Or maybe increase the ticket price. The price is already high, Daniel said gently. Any more and we'll lose half our local supporters. Sophie stared at the spreadsheet until the numbers blurred. They had just 2 weeks until the event, and despite all their hard work, the gap between what they needed and what they might raise seemed to be growing instead of shrinking. Maybe we should have thought of something else, she whispered, her earlier confidence faltering. Something bigger, or... Daniel turned her chair to face him. Sophie, look at what you've already accomplished. The way you've rallied the community, brought people together. That means something, regardless of the outcome. But Sophie couldn't quite shake the feeling that they were running out of time, and their best efforts might not be enough to save the vineyard she'd grown to love almost as much as the man beside her. Twinkling lights strung between the ancient oak trees transformed the vineyard into an enchanted garden. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting a magical glow over the evening. Sophie stood at the entrance, greeting guests in a simple blue dress that Daniel had insisted on buying for her. "Welcome to Sterling Vineyard," she said warmly to each arrival, her heart swelling as familiar faces from the community stepped onto the property. Local shop owners, business leaders, and wine enthusiasts filled the growing crowd, their excited chatter creating a buzz of energy. Daniel appeared beside her, looking dashing in his tailored suit. "The caterers are all set up," he whispered, his hand briefly touching the small of her back. "And Marcus says the wine selection for the auction is displaying beautifully in the barn." Sophie nodded, trying to contain her nervous energy. "Look at all these people," she breathed, watching as more cars pulled up the gravel driveway. "I can't believe how many showed up." The transformed barn glowed with warm light, its rustic wooden beams draped with fairy lights and white fabric. Inside, elegant tables showcased silent auction items, rare vintage wines, weekend getaways, and local artworks. The scent of gourmet appetizers wafted through the air as servers circulated with trays of carefully crafted hors d'oeuvres. "Mrs. Henderson just arrived," Daniel pointed out, nodding toward an elderly woman stepping carefully from her car. "She's been buying our wine since my grandfather's time." Sophie watched as Daniel went to help Mrs. Henderson, offering his arm with genuine warmth. The sight made her heart flutter. This was the real Daniel, caring and connected to his community, not the distant businessman he'd nearly become. As the evening progressed, the energy continued to build. The local string quartet played softly in the corner while guests mingled, bid on auction items, and shared stories about the vineyard's history. Sophie overheard snippets of conversation about first dates among the vines, wedding proposals, and family picnics from years past. "The bidding is going well," Marcus reported, appearing at Sophie's side with a tablet showing the current totals. "People are being very generous." Sophie's eyes widened at the numbers. They were already well above their initial projections, and the live auction hadn't even started yet. She searched the crowd for Daniel and found him deep in conversation with a group of local business owners, his expression animated as he discussed the vineyard's legacy. When dinner was served under the stars, the setting couldn't have been more perfect. Lights twinkled overhead, wine flowed freely, and laughter filled the air. Sophie watched as Daniel stood to give his speech, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "This vineyard isn't just about wine," he said, his eyes meeting Sophie's. "It's about community, about connections, about the memories we create together. Thanks to all of you, and especially to Sophie, I'm beginning to remember that." The crowd applauded warmly, and Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. As the live auction began, the excitement was palpable. Paddles raised again and again as guests bid enthusiastically on premium wine packages and exclusive vineyard experiences. When the final numbers came in, Sophie could hardly believe it. They'd raised more than double their initial goal. She rushed to find Daniel, her heart soaring with triumph. "Daniel, look!" she exclaimed, showing him the total. "We did it!" But Daniel's response wasn't quite what she'd expected. While his smile was genuine, there was still uncertainty in his eyes. "It's amazing, Sophie. Truly," he said, squeezing her hand. "But I'm not sure if even this will be enough to save everything." The morning after the fundraiser, Sophie hummed quietly as she cleared away the last traces of celebration from the vineyard's grounds. Golden sunlight streamed through the oak trees, catching on dewdrops that clung to the grapevines. Her muscles ached from the previous night's work, but her heart felt light with hope. She watched Daniel through the window of his office, pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear. His brow was furrowed, and his free hand kept running through his hair. A nervous habit she'd come to recognize. Something wasn't right. When Daniel's voice raised enough for her to hear through the glass, Sophie's stomach dropped. "Marcus, I understand the numbers, but—" He paused, listening. "Yes, I know the deadline is approaching." Sophie's hands trembled as she gathered more empty wine glasses onto her tray. The fundraiser had been so successful. Surely it had to make a difference. She'd seen the way Daniel's eyes had lit up during the event, how he'd connected with everyone there. The office door swung open, and Daniel emerged, his face drawn. His tie hung loose around his neck, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "That was my business manager," he said, his voice heavy. Sophie set down her tray. "What did he say?" "He wants me to move forward with the corporate sale." Daniel leaned against the doorframe, looking exhausted. "Says we can't afford to wait any longer. The investor's getting impatient." "But the fundraiser," Sophie protested, stepping closer. "We raised so much more than we expected. Doesn't that count for something?" Daniel's fingers drummed against his thigh. "It's incredible what everyone did, Sophie, really. But Marcus laid out all the numbers." He shook his head. "Even with the fundraiser money, we're looking at years of careful management before the vineyard would be truly profitable again." "Then that's what we'll do," Sophie insisted, reaching for his hand. "We'll manage it carefully. Together." His fingers tightened around hers for a moment before letting go. "I need time to think," he said quietly. "This isn't just about money anymore. It's about responsibility, legacy." His eyes met hers. "And now it's about us, too." Sophie's throat felt tight. "What do you mean?" "If I keep the vineyard and it fails, I'll lose everything my family built. But if I sell it—" He swallowed hard. "I'll be giving up on everything we talked about, everything we dreamed about last night." Sophie watched as Daniel turned back toward his office, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the decision. He paused at the threshold. "I just need some time," he repeated, not looking back. "To think it through properly." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sophie standing alone among the remnants of last night's celebration. Her stomach churned with worry as she watched him through the window again, now slumped at his desk with his head in his hands. The morning breeze rustled through the vineyard, carrying the sweet scent of ripening grapes. Sophie pressed her hand against the cool glass, wishing she could somehow make this easier for him. But all she could do was wait, her heart aching as Daniel wrestled with a decision that would change both their lives forever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the vineyard as Sophie found Daniel in the wine cellar, methodically checking inventory lists. The musty scent of oak barrels and aging wine filled the cool air around them. "We need to talk," Sophie said, her voice echoing slightly in the dim space. Daniel didn't look up from his clipboard. "There's nothing to discuss, Sophie. The numbers don't lie." "Numbers aren't everything." She moved closer, placing her hand on one of the barrels. "This place has history, meaning. You can't reduce that to figures on a spreadsheet." Finally, he turned to face her, his expression tight. "You don't understand. Running a vineyard isn't just about passion. It's about hard business decisions." "I understand more than you think," Sophie shot back, her voice rising slightly. "I understand that you're scared, that it's easier to give up than to risk failure." Daniel's jaw clenched. "You call this giving up? I've poured everything I have into this place, every penny, every minute." He gestured around the cellar. "And it's still not enough." "It could be," Sophie insisted. "The fundraiser showed how many people believe in this place. We could organize more events, build a stronger community presence." "And what happens when that's not enough either?" Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp. "When we've exhausted every option and we're still drowning in debt? When the bank comes calling?" Sophie stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Then we'll face it together. But at least we'll know we tried everything." "Sophie." Daniel's voice softened, but his resolve remained firm. "Sometimes trying isn't enough. Sometimes you have to know when to let go." "No." She shook her head fiercely. "That's not the Daniel I know. The Daniel I fell in love with wouldn't just surrender something this important." His eyes flashed. "Love doesn't pay the bills, Sophie. Love doesn't maintain equipment or pay workers' salaries." "But it gives you the strength to keep fighting," she countered, reaching for his hand. He pulled away, and the gesture felt like a physical blow. "I have to be realistic," he said, turning back to his inventory list. "The corporate offer is solid. They'll keep some of the staff on, maintain the basic operation." "They'll turn it into a tourist trap," Sophie interrupted, her voice cracking. "Everything that makes this place special will be gone." "At least it will still exist," Daniel said quietly. "Better that than watching it crumble completely." Sophie felt tears burning in her eyes. She blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. "So that's it? You've already made up your mind?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and shattered dreams. Daniel's shoulders sagged, but he didn't turn around. "I have to do what's best for everyone involved," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie took a step backward, then another. The cool cellar air suddenly felt suffocating. "What's best for everyone?" she repeated hollowly. "Or what's easiest for you?" When he didn't respond, she turned away, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor as she retreated. Each step felt heavier than the last, carrying her away from the man she loved and the dreams they'd shared just days ago. At the cellar door, she paused, her hand resting on the rough wooden frame. Behind her, the quiet sounds of Daniel's inventory taking resumed, as if their conversation had never happened, as if her heart wasn't breaking with every breath. Sophie wandered through the mansion's empty hallways, her footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. Her earlier conversation with Daniel in the wine cellar played over and over in her mind, each replay bringing fresh waves of hurt and doubt. She paused by a large window overlooking the vineyard, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The late afternoon sun painted the rows of vines in golden light, making them look almost magical. But the sight only made her heart ache more. "What was I thinking?" she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the window. That love would be enough to save everything? Moving away from the window, Sophie found herself in the kitchen, where this had all started, where Daniel had overheard her wishing for a boyfriend. It felt like a lifetime ago now. She slumped into one of the chairs at the small breakfast table, running her fingers along its worn wooden surface. The doubts she'd been pushing away came flooding in. Maybe she was just the housekeeper who'd gotten too caught up in a fantasy. Maybe her simple background and practical solutions weren't enough for someone like Daniel, someone who dealt with million-dollar decisions and corporate negotiations. "I clean houses," she said aloud to the empty kitchen. "What do I know about saving vineyards?" Her eyes burned with unshed tears, as she remembered the hope in Daniel's face during the fundraiser, how it had slowly faded in the days that followed. She'd pushed him, challenged him, thinking she could help him find the strength to fight. But what if she'd only made things harder for him? Sophie pulled out her phone, looking at the notes she'd made about possible solutions for the vineyard. The ideas that had seemed so promising now looked naive and insufficient. Community events, local partnerships, tourism initiatives, they all required time and resources they might not have. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her quickly wipe her eyes. When she looked up, Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "I've been looking for you," he said softly. Sophie straightened in her chair, trying to maintain her composure. "I thought everything was already decided." Daniel crossed the kitchen slowly, pulling out the chair across from her. "I'm sorry about earlier," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I shouldn't have dismissed your ideas like that, or pushed you away." "It's fine," Sophie replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't. "You were just being realistic." "No," Daniel shook his head. "I was being a coward." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. "The truth is, I'm terrified. Not just of losing the vineyard, but of trying and failing, of disappointing everyone who believes in me." Sophie looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the vulnerability in his eyes that he usually kept hidden. "After my parents died," he continued, "keeping this place running became my way of holding on to them, but maybe I've been so focused on not losing it that I forgot what made it special in the first place." "And what's that?" Sophie asked quietly. "The way it brings people together, creates memories, builds connections." He finally took her hand. "Like it did with us." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay focused. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're right." Daniel squeezed her hand. "We should keep fighting. Give it one more try, if you're willing to help me." Sophie spread out a collection of papers across Daniel's antique mahogany desk in his study. Spreadsheets, local business contacts, and potential investment proposals covered every inch of the polished surface. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over their workspace. "Look at these numbers again," Sophie said, pointing to a financial statement. "The vineyard's heritage status could qualify us for special grants. We haven't explored that angle yet." Daniel leaned forward in his leather chair, his sleeve brushing against hers as he studied the document. "You might be onto something there. The buildings are over 100 years old." "Exactly." Sophie's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "And your family's contribution to the local wine industry is significant. That's got to count for something." She pulled out another paper from her stack, this one filled with her neat handwriting. "I've also been thinking about those empty cottages on the north end of the property. What if we renovated them into vacation rentals? It could create a steady income stream." Daniel's expression softened as he watched her explain her ideas. Her energy was contagious, and he found himself getting caught up in her optimism. "You've really thought this through, haven't you?" "Someone has to," she smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Besides, this place is too special to give up without a fight." They spent the next hour going through Sophie's carefully researched proposals. She had contacted local tourism boards, researched grant opportunities, and even drafted potential partnership agreements with nearby businesses. "We could host regular events," she continued, pulling out another document. "Wine tastings, cooking classes, wedding receptions. The possibilities are endless." Daniel nodded, his initial skepticism giving way to genuine interest. "The old barrel room could be converted into an event space. My father always talked about doing that." "See?" Sophie touched his arm gently. "There are so many opportunities we haven't explored yet. We just need to think creatively." Daniel stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the rolling hills of grapevines. The morning dew still clung to the leaves, making them sparkle in the sunlight. "You make it sound so possible," he said softly. "It is possible," Sophie joined him at the window. "But we need to act fast. The corporate offer isn't the only option." Daniel turned to face her, his expression determined. "You're right. Let's make a list of potential investors to contact today. People who understand the value of keeping this place intact." They returned to the desk, and Sophie pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "I already have some names," she said, beginning to write. "Local business owners, wine enthusiasts, people who care about preserving the valley's heritage." "Add the Morrison family to that list," Daniel said, his voice stronger now. "They've been in the wine business for generations. They might understand what we're trying to preserve here." Sophie smiled as she wrote, feeling the shift in Daniel's energy. His renewed determination filled her with hope. Together they crafted a detailed action plan, setting clear goals and deadlines for each initiative. "We'll need to move quickly," Daniel said, reviewing their final list. "The corporate buyers are expecting an answer by the end of the month." "Then we'll move quickly," Sophie replied, her voice firm. "We've got nothing to lose by trying." They agreed to split up the list of potential investors, each taking responsibility for different contacts. Their plan wasn't just about raising money anymore. It was about finding people who shared their vision for the vineyard's future. The Italian restaurant bustled with lunchtime activity as Sophie and Daniel sat across from Marcus Bennett, a successful local businessman known for his commitment to preserving the valley's heritage. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow over their corner table. Sophie smoothed her skirt nervously under the table, while Daniel presented their proposal. She watched as Marcus studied the documents spread before him, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. "These projections are quite impressive," Marcus said, looking up from the papers. "I particularly like the idea of converting those old cottages into vacation rentals. That could bring in significant revenue." Daniel nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Sophie came up with that idea. She's been instrumental in developing our revival plan." Marcus turned to Sophie with interest. "Tell me more about your vision for the event space." Sophie sat up straighter, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The barrel room has so much potential. With its historic architecture and atmosphere, it could host everything from wine tastings to corporate retreats. We've already received inquiries from several wedding planners." "The local tourism board is also interested in partnering with us," Daniel added, sliding another document across the table. "They see the vineyard as a key attraction for the region." Marcus took a sip of his water, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've always admired your family's vineyard, Daniel. My father used to talk about how your grandfather helped him when he was just starting out in the business." Sophie watched Daniel's face soften at the mention of his grandfather. She knew how much the family history meant to him, even though he rarely talked about it. "The valley needs places like this," Marcus continued. "Too many historic properties have been lost to corporate development. I'd hate to see that happen here." He pulled out his phone and made a few quick calculations. "I think I could commit to matching the funds you've already raised through the fundraiser. That should give you enough leverage to secure additional financing." Sophie's heart leaped. She glanced at Daniel, who was sitting up straighter now, his eyes bright with possibility. "That would make a significant difference," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're grateful for your support, Marcus." "Don't thank me yet," Marcus smiled, reaching for his briefcase. "I'll have my lawyers draw up the paperwork, but I want you to know that I'm not just investing in the property, I'm investing in the two of you. Your passion for this place is evident." As they walked Marcus to his car after lunch, Sophie could hardly contain her excitement. The meeting had gone better than she'd dared to hope. Back inside the restaurant, Daniel pulled out Sophie's chair again as they sat down to finish their coffee. He seemed lost in thought, staring into his cup. "That went well," Sophie said softly, studying his face. "It did," he agreed, then looked up at her with an expression that made her heart skip. "You know, I've been thinking about how I've handled all of this. For so long, I convinced myself that I had to face everything alone, that asking for help somehow meant I was failing." Sophie reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You're not alone, Daniel." "I know that now," he said, his voice quiet. "But I've pushed away so many people who wanted to help, who cared." His eyes met hers. "Especially you, Sophie. You've been here all along, seeing possibilities I couldn't see, fighting for this place when I was ready to give up." The study felt unusually cold, despite the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows. Daniel sat at his mahogany desk, staring at the stack of papers before him. The corporate investor's final offer lay on top, the numbers more impressive than he'd initially expected. His Mont Blanc pen felt heavy in his hand as he hovered over the signature line. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, each sound echoing in the quiet room. Family photos lined the bookshelf behind him, generations of his family standing proudly in front of the vineyard. His grandfather's weathered face smiled from a particularly old photograph, reminding him of summer afternoons spent learning about the vines. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the pen to the paper. The door burst open, causing him to jump. "Daniel, wait!" Sophie rushed in, slightly out of breath. Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were wide with urgency. "Please don't sign those papers." He set the pen down slowly. "Sophie, we've discussed this. The offer is more than generous, and it would solve all our financial problems. But at what cost?" She moved closer to the desk, her voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't just about money. This vineyard is your heritage, your family's legacy." "A legacy that's drowning in debt," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Sophie placed her hands on the desk, leaning forward. "Remember what Marcus said yesterday? About how your grandfather helped his father? This place isn't just rows of grapes and old buildings. It's part of this community's history." Daniel ran his fingers through his hair, frustration evident in his gesture. "History doesn't pay the bills, Sophie." "No, but passion and determination do." She walked around the desk and knelt beside his chair, looking up at him. "Think about all the people who showed up at the fundraiser. They believe in this place, in you. Marcus is willing to invest because he sees what this vineyard could be." "It's still not enough," Daniel muttered, but his hand had moved away from the papers. "Then we'll find another way," Sophie insisted. "We can start small, implement changes gradually. The vacation rental idea is just the beginning. We could host cooking classes, wine-making workshops, maybe even start a small restaurant using produce from the kitchen garden." Daniel looked down at her earnest face, seeing the determination in her eyes. He thought about the corporate investors' plans to modernize the vineyard, strip away its character, turn it into just another mass production facility. "My grandfather used to say that wine isn't made by machines," he said quietly. "It's made by people who pour their hearts into the land." Sophie nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "And your heart is here, Daniel. I see it every time you walk through the vineyards, every time you talk about the harvest, every time you share stories about your family." Daniel picked up the contract, his fingers running along the edges of the paper. In one swift motion, he tore it in half. "What are you doing?" Sophie gasped. "Choosing my legacy," he replied, continuing to tear the contract into smaller pieces. "Choosing to fight for what matters. We'll find another way, Sophie. It won't be easy, but you're right. This place is worth saving." Sophie's face broke into a brilliant smile as she watched the torn pieces of paper flutter onto the desk. Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a determination he hadn't felt in years. The morning sun cast long shadows across Daniel's office as his financial advisor, Mr. Peterson, paced back and forth, his face red with frustration. "This is madness, absolute madness." Peterson waved his hands in the air. "That contract was our lifeline. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Daniel sat calmly behind his desk, Sophie standing supportively by his side. "I know exactly what I'm doing, James. For the first time in years, I'm making a decision that feels right." "Feelings don't pay bills," Peterson scoffed, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The vineyard's expenses are mounting, and we'll find another way," Sophie interjected firmly. She placed a stack of papers on Daniel's desk. "I've been researching sustainable farming techniques that could cut our operational costs by 30% within the first year." Daniel picked up the papers, scanning through Sophie's neat notes and carefully compiled data. His eyes widened as he read. "These numbers, they're impressive." "That's not all," Sophie continued, pulling out more documents. "I've contacted several local restaurants interested in farm-to-table partnerships. They're willing to commit to regular orders if we can guarantee organic certification." Peterson shook his head. "Converting to organic farming takes years." 3 years, Daniel corrected, becoming more animated as he read through Sophie's research. "And we can start the transition immediately. The soil testing shows we're already halfway there thanks to my grandfather's traditional methods." The financial advisor threw up his hands in defeat. "Well, don't come crying to me when it all falls apart." He stormed out of the office, letting the door slam behind him. Sophie flinched at the sound, but quickly recovered. "Don't let him discourage you. Look at this." She spread out a detailed map of the vineyard on Daniel's desk. "These sections here and here would be perfect for hosting outdoor events. We could start with small gatherings, then work our way up to weddings and corporate retreats." Daniel stood up and moved closer to examine the map, his shoulder brushing against Sophie's. The contact sent a warm tingle through both of them, but they remained focused on the task at hand. "The old storage barn could be converted into an event space," he mused, pointing to a spot on the map. "My mother always said it had the best view of the sunset." They spent the next hour planning and strategizing, their excitement growing with each new idea. When they finally took a break, they moved to the window overlooking the sprawling vineyard. The late afternoon light painted the grapevines in shades of gold and green. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying the sweet scent of ripening fruit. Daniel turned to Sophie, his eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing in this place, for believing in me." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "This vineyard is special, Daniel. It just needed someone to fight for it." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun's rays dance across the rolling hills of vines. The weight of their decision hung in the air, but it felt more like anticipation than burden. "It won't be easy," Daniel murmured, his voice thoughtful. "The best things never are," Sophie replied, her shoulder gently touching his as they gazed out at their future spreading before them. The vineyard buzzed with activity as workers strung twinkling lights between the ancient oak trees that lined the central courtyard. White chairs formed neat rows on the manicured lawn, and elegant flower arrangements adorned every table. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, casting a magical glow over the gathering crowd. Sophie adjusted a crooked centerpiece, her hands trembling slightly. "Do you think enough people will come?" she asked Maria, one of the vineyard's longtime employees who was helping with the preparations. "Are you kidding?" Maria laughed, gesturing to the growing number of cars pulling into the parking area. "The whole town is here. Everyone wants to know what's happening with the vineyard." Indeed, familiar faces from the community filed in steadily. Local business owners, neighboring farmers, and families who had been buying wine from the vineyard for generations. They chatted amongst themselves, creating a warm buzz of conversation that filled the air. Daniel emerged from the main building, looking sharp in a navy suit. His usual confident stride faltered slightly when he saw the size of the crowd. Sophie caught his eye and gave him an encouraging smile, which he returned with a grateful nod. "I didn't expect so many people," he whispered as he passed by her. "They care about this place," Sophie replied softly. "Just like we do." As the last rays of sunlight faded, the string lights twinkled to life, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. The crowd settled into their seats, and Daniel made his way to the small podium set up at the front. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Thank you all for coming tonight. As many of you know, this vineyard has been in my family for generations. Recently, I considered selling it to a corporate investor." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel paused, his eyes finding Sophie's in the sea of faces. "But sometimes," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "we need someone to remind us of what truly matters, someone to show us that the easy path isn't always the right one." He gestured for Sophie to join him at the podium. She hesitated for a moment before walking forward, her cheeks flushing as all eyes turned to her. "This woman, Sophie Miller, helped me see what I was about to lose. Not just a business, but a legacy, a home, a part of this community that has stood for over 100 years. Daniel turned to face her directly. "Sophie, your unwavering support and dedication showed me that this vineyard is worth fighting for. Your practical solutions and creative ideas proved that we can adapt and thrive without sacrificing what makes this place special." The crowd broke into spontaneous applause. Sophie noticed several people wiping tears from their eyes, including Maria, who beamed proudly from her seat. "I'm announcing tonight that not only have I canceled the sale, but I'm also committing to keeping this vineyard in the family, where it belongs." Daniel's voice cracked slightly with emotion. "We'll be implementing new sustainable farming practices and expanding our community involvement. This vineyard isn't just my heritage, it's part of all of yours too." The applause grew louder. Several local business owners stood up, calling out offers of support and collaboration. The mayor stepped forward, pledging the town's backing for their new initiatives. The atmosphere crackled with excitement and possibility. Through it all, Sophie stood beside Daniel, her heart full as she watched the community rally around them. The vineyard had always been beautiful, but tonight, under the twinkling lights and stars, surrounded by the warmth and support of their neighbors, it felt truly magical. The crowd gradually dispersed into smaller groups, mingling around tables laden with wine and hors d'oeuvres. The string lights swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting dancing shadows across the vineyard grounds. Sophie stood near one of the oak trees, watching the joyful scene unfold before her, still processing the events of the evening. "Sophie?" Daniel's voice was soft behind her. She turned to find him holding 2 glasses of their finest red wine. "Would you walk with me for a moment?" She nodded, accepting one of the glasses. They strolled in comfortable silence past the courtyard, following a path that led to a secluded spot overlooking the rows of grapevines. The stars twinkled overhead, and the distant sound of laughter and music from the party created a gentle backdrop. Daniel stopped at a wooden bench and gestured for her to sit. Sophie smoothed her dress and settled beside him, her heart beating a little faster at his proximity. The moonlight caught the silver in his hair, and his usually stern expression had softened into something more vulnerable. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. "About the vineyard, about my life, about us." Sophie held her breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. She'd learned to read his moods over the years, but tonight, there was something different in his voice. Something she'd never heard before. "When I hired you as the house manager, I thought I was just getting someone to maintain the mansion." He turned to face her fully. "I never expected to find someone who would challenge me, support me, and make me see everything differently." His hand found hers on the bench between them. "Sophie, you've become so much more than an employee. You've become my closest confidant, my partner in saving this vineyard, and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The person I most want to share my life with." Sophie's breath caught in her throat as Daniel continued, his voice growing more earnest. "I don't want you to be my maid anymore. I want you as my equal, my partner in everything. These past few weeks have shown me that together, we can accomplish anything." He set his wine glass down and took both her hands in his. "I know this might seem sudden, or maybe it's been building for years, but I can't imagine running this vineyard or living my life without you by my side." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes as emotions overwhelmed her. All the feelings she'd kept buried, all the moments she'd forced herself to maintain professional distance, came rushing to the surface. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I've dreamed of hearing those words for so long. Working here, being close to you, but always maintaining that distance. It's been the sweetest torture." She squeezed his hands, her heart pounding. "Of course I want to be your partner, in everything. I love this vineyard almost as much as I love you." Daniel's eyes widened at her confession, and a smile spread across his face. Not his usual reserved smile, but one of pure joy. He reached up to cup her cheek, brushing away a tear with his thumb. They moved toward each other slowly, as if in a dream. When their lips finally met, it was soft and sweet, full of promise and possibility. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate as years of unspoken feelings poured out. The stars seemed to shine brighter overhead, blessing their moment of connection. The morning sun cast long shadows across the vineyard as Sophie and Daniel walked between the rows of vines, clipboards in hand. The early autumn air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of ripening grapes. They'd been up since dawn, discussing ways to modernize the vineyard's operations while preserving its cherished traditions. "What if we converted this section to organic farming?" Sophie pointed to a map spread out between them. "We could start small, maybe 5 acres, and see how it goes." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, his shoulder brushing against hers as he leaned in to study the map. "That could work. The soil tests came back positive for that area." He smiled at her, still amazed by how naturally they worked together. "You've really done your research." "Well, someone had to," she teased, bumping his arm playfully. "Besides, I found these amazing sustainable farming practices that could cut our water usage by 30%. They continued their walk, stopping occasionally to inspect the vines or make notes. The workers they passed nodded respectfully, already used to seeing them together as a team. It felt right, natural, as if this was how it had always been meant to be. In the distance, construction crews were working on renovating the old tasting room. It had been Sophie's idea to transform it into a cozy wine bar where visitors could learn about winemaking while sampling their products. Daniel watched as she sketched quick designs for the interior layout, her face animated with excitement. "We could host wine tasting classes here," she said, gesturing to the space. "Maybe even partner with local restaurants for food pairings." "You're full of surprises," Daniel said softly, wrapping an arm around her waist. "I never thought I'd see this place thriving again." They made their way to their favorite spot, the wooden bench overlooking the valley. It had become their unofficial meeting place, where they shared ideas, dreams, and quiet moments together. The morning fog was just lifting, revealing the patchwork of vineyards below. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, taking her hand in his, "about the future. Our future." He turned to face her, his expression serious but warm. "I want to build something lasting here, not just with the vineyard, but with you." Sophie squeezed his hand, her heart swelling. "I'd like that too. There's so much potential here, so many possibilities." "I was thinking we could restore the old cottage near the south field," he continued. "Make it our home. It's smaller than the mansion, but—" "It's perfect," Sophie interrupted, her eyes shining. "Somewhere that's just ours." They spent the next hour planning their future together, discussing renovation ideas for the cottage, brainstorming new wine blends, and mapping out the next year of improvements for the vineyard. Their conversations flowed naturally from business to personal matters, their shared passion for the vineyard intertwining with their growing love for each other. "We could have the wedding here," Sophie mused, then blushed when she realized what she'd said. "I mean, hypothetically, someday." Daniel chuckled, pulling her closer. "I like the sound of that. Someday soon, perhaps." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "First, let's focus on getting through harvest season." Sophie nodded, contentedly resting her head on his shoulder as they looked out over their vineyard. Their vineyard. The thought made her smile. Together they had not just saved this place, they had given it new life, just as it had given new life to their love. The autumn morning buzzed with activity as Sophie stood in the newly renovated office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. The deed to the vineyard lay on the polished oak desk, freshly signed and notarized. Daniel beamed beside her, his hand resting comfortably on the small of her back. "I can't believe this is really happening," Sophie whispered, running her fingers over the embossed letterhead. The document made it official. They were now co-managers of the vineyard, partners in every sense of the word. "Believe it," Daniel said, squeezing her shoulder. "You earned this." Through the large windows, they could see workers installing the new irrigation system they'd designed together. The organic section was already showing promising results, with healthier vines and richer soil. Their sustainable farming practices had caught the attention of several environmental organizations, bringing positive publicity to the vineyard. "Mr. Thompson wants to schedule another tour next week," Sophie said, checking her tablet. "That's the third sustainable farming group this month." She smiled, remembering how skeptical some had been about their modern approach to vineyard management. The renovated tasting room had become a local hotspot, exactly as Sophie had envisioned. Their wine tasting classes were booked solid for the next 3 months, and local restaurants were clamoring to feature their wines. The old vineyard had transformed into a vibrant destination while maintaining its cherished charm. "The new rosé blend is ready for bottling," Daniel announced, reviewing the production reports. The test batch received excellent feedback. Sophie grinned. It was her recipe, a delicate blend she'd developed during their late-night experimentation sessions. "We should save a few bottles for the ceremony," she suggested. The ceremony. Her heart fluttered at the thought. They'd planned something small and intimate, just close friends and family gathering at sunset among the vines. The old wooden arch at the end of the main row had been restored, wrapped in fairy lights and autumn flowers. They walked outside, inspecting the grounds. Workers called out greetings as they passed, and Sophie stopped to chat with Maria, their new tour guide, about the upcoming events. The sense of community they'd built filled her with pride. The cottage renovation was nearly complete, transformed from a weathered building into a cozy home that perfectly suited them. They'd preserved its rustic charm while adding modern comforts, creating a space that represented their blend of traditional and contemporary approaches. As they reached their favorite bench, Daniel pulled Sophie close. "Remember when we first sat here?" he asked, his voice soft with memory. "When you convinced me not to sell?" Sophie leaned into him, nodding. "You were so stubborn," she teased. "Good thing I'm more stubborn." The valley spread out before them, rows of healthy vines stretching toward the horizon. Solar panels glinted on the winery roof, another of their sustainable innovations. In the distance, workers were setting up chairs and tables for tomorrow's ceremony. "Everything's ready for tomorrow," Daniel said, his fingers intertwining with hers. "The minister will arrive at 5, just before sunset." Sophie watched as more decorations appeared. Lanterns being hung from the pergola, flowers arranged along the paths. Their small ceremony would mark more than just their union. It would celebrate everything they'd built together. This perfect blend of love and purpose. "We did it," Sophie whispered, taking in the thriving vineyard around them. "We really did it." Daniel turned to face her, his eyes full of love and pride. "We're just getting started," he said, pulling her close for a kiss as the sun began its descent over their flourishing vineyard. Morning sunlight streamed through the cottage windows, casting warm patterns across the kitchen table where Sophie and Daniel sat enjoying their breakfast. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the crisp autumn air drifting in through the open window. Sophie couldn't help but smile as she watched Daniel studying the latest production reports, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "The new organic section is producing better yields than we expected," he said, looking up with excitement in his eyes. "Your idea to implement those sustainable farming methods was brilliant." Sophie blushed at the compliment. "We make a good team," she replied, reaching across to squeeze his hand. The silver band on her finger caught the light, reminding her of how far they'd come. Through the window, they could see workers moving between the rows of vines, their voices carrying on the morning breeze. The vineyard had taken on new life since they'd implemented their changes. The soil was healthier, the vines more robust, and their wines were gaining recognition throughout the region. "Maria called earlier," Sophie mentioned, taking a sip of her coffee. "The weekend tours are completely booked for the next 2 months. People are really interested in learning about our organic farming methods." Daniel nodded, pride evident in his expression. "Who would have thought that going green would bring so many people to the vineyard?" He chuckled, remembering his initial skepticism. "You were right about that, too." They finished their breakfast and headed out to make their morning rounds. The autumn air was crisp and invigorating, carrying the sweet scent of ripening grapes. Workers called out greetings as they passed, and Sophie stopped to chat with several of them, asking about their families and listening to updates about the vines. Near the new tasting room, a group of visitors was gathering for the morning tour. The renovated building, with its blend of rustic charm and modern amenities, had become a popular destination. Sophie's wine appreciation classes were always full, and their special events drew people from all over the region. "Remember when you first brought me here?" Sophie asked, as they walked past the old bench where they'd shared so many important moments. "I never imagined we'd end up here." Daniel pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You changed everything," he said softly. "You showed me what was possible when you believe in something, and someone." They continued their walk through the vineyard, checking on the different sections. The experimental plot where they were testing new sustainable growing methods was showing promising results. The solar panels they'd installed were significantly reducing their energy costs, and their water conservation system had become a model for other vineyards in the region. As they reached the crest of the hill overlooking the valley, Daniel stopped and turned to Sophie. "I've never been happier," he said, his voice full of emotion. "This place, us, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." Sophie leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The vineyard stretched out before them, rows of healthy vines extending toward the horizon. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the land they'd worked so hard to preserve and improve. Hand in hand, they began walking down the hill, their steps in perfect sync. The future stretched out before them, as rich and full of promise as the vineyard itself. Their love had not only saved this special place, but had transformed it into something even more beautiful than before. As they walked among the vines, the setting sun warming their faces, Sophie knew that this was exactly where they were meant to be.